Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Peugeot. The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Media Clip, Advertech Printing, and Independent Photo Imagers.
Hello again, and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Peugeot, and today we're joined by John Watson, who's the founder, coach, and fractional CMO from a company called Accrue Marketing, and he's coming to us from Alberta, Canada today. Hi, John. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Gary. Thanks for asking. I really appreciate kind of joining you today.
So, John, tell us your story of your marketing journey that got us to the point where you're started Accrue Marketing.
I started out as a business kind of data analyst.
Okay.
And I used to analyze the performance of sales and marketing campaigns well before the internet.
Right. Okay.
And, it was direct mail and call center campaigns and that kind of stuff. I did, a lot of work for some of the big charities. And I found that I was always the bearer of bad news, right? And I learned really quickly that a lot of the sales and marketing campaigns that were running were very poorly conceived. Mm-hmm. And they had not run the numbers, not targeted well. And I used to joke that I should have one of the horsemen of the apocalypse as my logo, right? Because I was always showing up with this devastating bad news.
Right.
And so as I started my own company, my first company, I didn't want to repeat the experience. I saw how devastatingly poorly a lot of these things did. Mm-hmm. And so I started seeking out help. I said, look, I don't want to make the same mistakes, right? All I was getting was sold over and over by, everybody didn't want to help me. They just wanted to sell me.
Right.
On whatever it is they wanted to do. And I found it very difficult to get legitimate help.
Okay.
And I knew I needed it, right? So I just kept seeking it. And so how I got this kind of whole program going was I wanted to be the help that I couldn't find.
Right. Okay. That's great. So you saw an opportunity and you wanted to fill it. So awesome.
Yeah. Well, I just found that it's so difficult to actually move past the salespeople and actually get legitimate coaching and consulting and somebody who's willing to work with you to help you as opposed to just try to sell you. Mm-hmm. So that's really the genesis of my whole company was how do I show up in a way that I couldn't find for others once I had learned the ropes.
Yeah, you got to learn. You got to be able to learn what it is you're going to share in order to share it, right?
But as an analyst, when I started, one of the things that analysts do is they dig into the root causes of things, right? So it's not working, why?
Right.
And so I just kept digging into why, why from a messaging point of view, from design point of view, and it turned out that in most cases, it was a leadership issue.
Okay.
And a lack of communication, right? Mm-hmm. And so marketing, in my experience, has largely, the way I've come to understand it is that there's a lot of assumption. It's a tremendous amount of assumption. A lot of business owners, and particularly small business owners, but it's common across the board where they feel like they don't understand all the new tech, right? They're intimidated. So, older guys like us are sometimes intimidated by the technology. They don't really understand it. It's happening so fast that they're just like, look, I don't get this stuff. And they try to pawn it off on somebody else to do it.
Right.
Right. And so they'll hire a bunch of suppliers, right? That they think are consultants.
Right.
And more often than not, they're just salespeople, right? And they're pitching you on whatever it is they think is what they want to sell you. And it may or may not have anything to do with your needs.
Mm-hmm. Their agenda is to sell their platform, program, marketing, tech, or what have you.
Exactly. The leadership gap that happens is that in the interest of passing it off, that's something that you don't understand or really don't want to understand.
Right.
Right. You pass it off to somebody who really isn't understanding the role you think they're going to play.
Right.
Right. You think they're a consultant and they're just trying to sell you whatever. Mm-hmm. And you end up with this big leadership gap. Right. And then, so quite often there's no real clear goals established. There's no real conversation about how it's going to produce results or even what kind of results they expect. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with what I call this sort of random acts of marketing.
Right.
And the strategy, it basically comes down to hope and a prayer.
Right. Right.
And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a pretty bad combination.
Well, one of the things I want to circle back on is when you said you had to be the bearer of bad news, that kind of stuck out to me. So I made a note here. Like, what was the bad news? Was that money was wasted, that resources were squandered, was that results really weren't close to what they had expected? What would be a typical bad news scenario that as an analyst you had?
Well, quite often, what I found was if you didn't do the math ahead of time, right?
Mhm.
So I'll just share an example. I had a client where they were a one-time sale. It was a kind of an expensive sale. It was a $1,200 purchase, but the margins on it were really low. They only had $100 margin on a $1,200 sale.
Right.
And the marketing they were doing was costing them $1,100 per sale.
Oh gosh.
Right. And they had been doing that they were spending $500,000 a year
Right.
on their promotional program. And it was basically they were throwing the money away. They would have been better off to go have a big party in Vegas. But they never measured anything, right? They didn't know
Right.
that the performance of their marketing. So I was the first one to ever show them that here's your sales funnel. And your unit cost per sale on average is, vastly 10 times higher than the margin available on the product you're selling.
Right.
And there's no lifetime value because you're a one-time purchase.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's no
You're not
opportunity
building
to
a
make it back.
relationship with this customer because they're buying it once.
Yeah. And so it was a huge eye opener, right?
So how was that received, right? Because you've got a client or a business owner who's been doing something that they think is working, right? Or they think is effective, or at least they're looking busy, right? There's activity, which I think a lot of marketing has become. Let's look busy. Let's look like we're doing something, right? And so how was that received when you delivered that message? Did they change, or did they say, you know what, it works for us?
No, I don't think most people say it works for us. It's usually shock and awe. It's like some people run away and they say, you can't show this to the boss, right? You have to give me a chance to fix it before you share these data.
The $1,200 sale, what was the response to that? What did they do? What did they think?
I embraced it. They said, well, how come we are busy? They were making sales, but
Right,
their sales were coming from a different channel,
Hmm.
right? The vast majority of their business was coming from professional referrals.
Mm-hmm.
They had a pretty large community, a network that was driving business their way, and it was producing the vast majority of the work.
Okay.
And all of the so-called classic advertising and marketing they were doing was just taking whatever profits they were making and flushing it down the drain.
Mm.
Okay, so what do we do? Right? The answer is that's the next question is, okay, that's bad. What do we do? And in their case, it was just, look, let's focus on where you're generating the business and let's amplify that and do more of that. Right? Rather than wasting all that money over here, let's double down on what you're great at and make that exceptional. And they're like, great.
So one of the hardest things for a marketer or a business owner to do, one of the hardest words they have is no, right? I'm going to stop doing this because they've had this activity, generating interest or whatever. Like I said, it's expensive. It's eating up the entire cost of the product in this one channel, but they'd almost be better off not doing anything.
Well, you have to do something, but it really comes down to the most frequent conversation I have with people is now that you know your max cost of sale,
Right.
right? And you're starting and choosing advertising channels based on which ones have a hope,
Right.
at all of ever producing a sale within that cost.
Right. Exactly.
Right. And it eliminates most of them. Right. You look at it and say, all right, well, those are the constraints of the business.
Mm-hmm.
Which channels have a hope of actually producing profitable sales? And that alone makes a huge difference because you start focusing on things that can work.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean they will immediately,
Right.
but you know that the possibility is there, right? In many cases, a lot of the channels I see, in a perfect world where you had fantastic response rates, they still wouldn't produce a result that was workable.
Right.
Right. So it's like, why are we wasting time on that? But just simply by focusing on things that have the potential to work with sort of a reasonable margin of error,
Right.
you can really put the effort into those things because they have potential.
Right. Because one of the
Right.
things that like in my audience is, we've got a lot of people who, sell cameras, right? Which is a $1,200 device with a very low margin, right? As you know, because you mentioned
Yeah,
earlier, you're a photographer, right? So you know what cameras cost.
I
So,
do.
but again, it's the same sort of thing where the buyer for cameras is different now than it used to be because obviously people have camera phones. So you don't need a snapshot camera for everyday photography like you used to, right? So people are buying cameras differently. So you have to reach them where they are as opposed to traditional advertising.
Well, I think what it does is, whenever you have a low margin product, really the first thing to look at is how does lifetime value factor into the business?
Right.
Can I cultivate a relationship with this client? And
Right.
oftentimes, particularly in retail, we tend to take the order, and then we don't follow up with them, right? It doesn't go into an email database. We don't have necessarily, if we're advertising focused, we may not be putting enough effort into retention.
Right.
And what type of promotions can we run? How do we engage with people, get them coming back for all kinds of add-ons, right? And I think the first thing is to just look at how does the business work and where should we be focusing it? Is it on acquisition? Is it on retention? And what's the balance between the two that actually makes the most sense?
And so, what are some of the things that somebody should look at when they're trying to evaluate that? Because in many cases, again, in my audience, these are well-established businesses, right? They're brick and mortar. If they're a camera store or a 1 hour lab or a printer or a photo lab, they've been around for a while. There isn't a lot of startup activity there, right? But
Sure.
a lot of them make the assumption that everyone knows we're here because we've been here, right? So there has to be some sort of outreach to people who are unaware, but you also have to reach your current audience, right? So is there a formula or a percentage or something that you can look at for that?
You have to create the formula for the company.
Yeah. Okay. So
Right.
it's kind
And
of
that, I think
different.
that's really the goal. And I always try to talk about it in investment terms, right? So if you had an investment portfolio, you'd have money in different asset classes,
Right.
right? So if you think I have an acquisition asset class and I have a retention asset class and I have, maybe something for developing partners or channel partners. And it really comes down to, what are the asset classes? What allocation should I invest in each of them? And
Sure.
then how do I maximize the return from each one of those channels?
Right.
And the easiest way to do that is by looking at your data
Right.
and analyzing it. And most retailers are really good at logistics and managing inventory, and
Right.
the operational part of the business is critical. So they tend to be really good at that.
Right.
And the most common thing though is not doing customer data analysis.
Right.
Right. And the customer data analysis is usually not present in the point of sale software, right? It's just not something that's generally built in. And if
Right.
it is, it's pretty lame, right?
Well, what would be an example of useful data in that case, right? Because in most cases they're capturing, name, sometimes address, certainly an email if they can, sometimes a phone number. Isn't that useful, or what more do you need?
Absolutely. That's the beginning of it, right? So most things with customer data analysis, what you're looking for is where are they in their relationship with you,
Right.
right? Are they a first-time buyer? Is it the first time they've ever bought from you, right? So that's a welcome thing, right? The goal with that person is to get them to come back and be a repeat buyer.
Right.
If they've bought from you many times,
right.
once they're a steady repeat buyer, how do I upsell? How do I cross-sell them? Or how do I introduce them to other opportunities that you offer, right? When you have an opportunity to engage them, get feedback from them, try to turn them into an advocate where they get referrals, maybe turn them into an affiliate if they're into that sort of thing. It really comes down to if you can identify where a client is in the life cycle of the relationship with you, you
Right.
can communicate with them in appropriate ways to
Sure.
achieve very specific objectives,
Mhm.
right? But it tends to be like I said, it tends to not be part of the software,
Right.
right? So it requires you to kind of dig in, pull the data out, segment it all up in a meaningful way, and then to do some sort of segmented communication out to the different groups.
Now, if you're your typical business owner, that sounds like a lot of work. And it's continuous work, because you've got hopefully new customers coming in all the time that you got to figure out where they are and their journey. Is this something they can do themselves, or should they put it on staff or hire? I mean, where do you put that sort of thing in a
The
business?
beauty is this stuff is now accessible to small businesses. It's pretty affordable.
Yeah.
It really is, you're getting into automation, right? So like I said, part of the problem with the point of sale systems is you need to get your data out of it, but that doesn't mean you have to manhandle it, right? You can have connections
Right.
directly made to another system, like a CRM system, for example, right? So the data comes out of your point of sale into the CRM aggregates it up into meaningful ways. And then you can start to do triggered emails and text messages and communication that are all programmed with workflows, right? And this is all available in fairly entry-level CRMs now.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's not rocket science anymore.
Funny you say it, because a lot of systems, everything wants to be a CRM now, right? I mean, I use MailChimp for my newsletter, and it wants to be a CRM. I mean, so there's a lot of technology being built and across different platforms, actually, to let you do this sort of thing.
More and more with everything up in the cloud, you can integrate things so much easier than you could. Even if you have a couple of components that are, traditional software, you still have the ability in most cases to integrate them and to automate this kind of stuff.
You've used the phrase a couple of times, random acts of marketing. Where did that come from, and what does that mean?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you're a podcast host or someone wanting to be interviewed on podcasts as a guest, visit podmatch.com. Podmatch automatically connects ideal podcast guests and hosts together for interviews. We always say it works just like a dating app, but instead of connecting you for dates, it connects you for podcast interviews. Podmatch has connected over 85,000 guests and hosts together for interviews that listeners love, all while saving you countless hours of administrative work through built-in automations. If you're ready to level up your podcast interviews on either side of the mic, start today by visiting podmatch.com.
Random acts of marketing comes from that earlier conversation about sort of being sold on tactics, right? Like the whole, we're inundated with tactical stuff all the time. It's Facebook this and TikTok that and Instagram this, right? And it's all we get is this bombardment of tactical things, and it's overwhelming.
Right. Yeah.
And so a lot of people feel like, geez, it's like fear of missing out, right? I need to be on that platform and I need to do this and I need to do this. Right. And they're just sort of racing to keep up with the trends. And you're not doing it for good business reasons. You're doing it because you think you should.
Right.
Anecdotally.
But I guess my point is, why is it with marketing specifically that people do that? They don't do it with other parts of their business. You know what I mean? It's almost like...
It's, why though, is because people don't understand it, right?
Okay.
Marketing has always had this sort of mystery, romance. It's like airy fairy, it's emotional, it's creative, it's something else that I don't understand, right? And then now technology, right? Now it's super high tech. And so you have this combination of, it's mystical, right? It's this, the thing I don't understand. And so because I don't understand it, I'm likely to be passing it off to somebody else. And sort of, it makes you susceptible to being sold on stuff that you don't really need or understand.
Right.
And in many cases aren't ready for.
Right.
And it's a very slippery slope.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I ask that is because it seems like a lot of it is, like I said, I call it chasing the shiny, right? You got a shiny object that's and you just chase it down. And it's, I'll go to an industry conference and there'll be a marketing presentation. Somebody will get up there and they'll talk about their TikTok experience, right? Oh, I moved this many lenses on TikTok and, this kind of thing. And, everyone immediately tries to copy them. But what they are not copying is the process of how that person actually sold all those lenses on TikTok, right? Like, who did they target? What was the demographic, right? They just said, oh no, you got to do TikTok videos, right?
Well, the other thing is, just because you sold it on TikTok doesn't mean it was profitable.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Right. What did it cost you to make that sale?
Right.
And it seems low, but quite often the social media has a lot of human costs, right? The amount of time and energy you put into it
Sure.
is often ignored, right? So when you start to do full cost analysis of some of these channels, they're not as effective as they appear to be.
Right.
They
Right.
can be, right? But they're often not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's funny you said because, I've done it. I'm not an expert like yourself, but, there is sort of, the classic things very often are classic because they work, like direct response postcards, right? If you have a lawn care business and you need to reach people with lawns, you can do that very effectively with a postcard, and
Sure.
it's very cost effective. You don't need to be doing TikTok videos and dances with your John Deere and things like that. But it's just funny because it's like, well, that's not cool. That's not happening. That's not, but guess what? It's darn effective.
My recommendation for most small business owners is I use it like an apple tree analogy, right? And you think about all this fancy stuff is you're picking the apples at the very top of the tree first.
Right.
Like you're looking around, there's apples all over the ground, right?
Yeah.
I can reach most of them. I don't have to get the ladder out and do that. I can focus on the low hanging fruit or what's dropped off already.
Right.
And quite often we ignore those things, right? They're free, they're low cost, they're easy, they're in many cases have a higher demand, like the higher intentionality from the buyer. And we're spending our time kind of climbing the ladder, grabbing stuff and kind of focusing where we're just trying to get attention. And there's no intentionality, right? But we've interrupted them. They're aware of us now, but that doesn't mean they're going to buy.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So much of it is just take care of the fundamentals first. Make sure you understand what the economics are and that you're making, decisions that actually support your business as opposed to just distract you.
So if you're let's say your typical camera store, right? And you've got a mix of products in the sense you've got, your higher end cameras that you make very little money on. You got your accessories, which you make more money on, but they're a little harder to sell. And then you've got your high margin print products, right? Your output, your print, your cameras, or your canvases, your metals, and your photo books, and all those great products, right? But most people envision you in their head as a camera store, right? That's sort of what gets the attention. What would you do in that situation in terms of, would you just focus on the margin things and just keep on doing what you're doing, or try and?
No, I think you always have your lead offers that try to draw people into the store.
Right.
And this is where circling back to the customer analysis, right? If you know what they bought, if they bought a high-end camera, there's a good likelihood they're going to buy some lenses and they're going to buy some accessories and all kinds of stuff, right? They're into it.
Yeah.
And if they're, you can use their purchase patterns to guide you in terms of how to communicate it. So the segmented communication is really underutilized. Right. And by recognizing where people are in their life cycle, by identifying what kind of buyer they are they an aficionado? Are they professional? Are they a semi-pro? Are they just somebody who's messing around?
Yeah.
You really can you can communicate to them in that way. I mean, it's not from an acquisition point of view, but even in an acquisition point of view, you can tailor to different audiences based on what you're trying to sell.
Right. If you have a picture of, let's say you have your aficionado, right? The old retired dentist meme, right? Where, this is the guy who's going to buy a Leica and go to Alaska, and, he's going to spend a lot of money on hardware, right? So you may have a few of those people. So how would you use that customer to get more people like him? You know what I'm saying?
Again, it depends on who they are. I think now everybody's a social media influencer in some way.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're doing that kind of high-end photography, you're probably posting it. You can incentivize them to really give you feedback, to make introductions, turn them into a fan or a source of referrals.
Right.
Quite often those people are they can be training other people. I know I do. People come to me all the time and say, how do I use my camera? Right. So you can, and I've sent so many people to local photography shops because I like them. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think part of it is the customer service side. If I'm really enamored with the shop because I absolutely love the product line and I like how they treat me and, what they offer, they sort of help me out, right? Then I'm going to send people there.
Right.
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 And I think part of it is really looking at the marketing in a holistic way, right? So everybody tends to think marketing is advertising, right? Or the acquisition side. And they miss, there's a whole, I mean, the vast majority, most of the marketing should actually be retention and customer engagement,
Right.
and gathering customer feedback and generating reviews and testimonials and referrals. And you know, the margins on that are vastly higher
Right.
than, you know, you usually lose money on your acquisition.
Right.
And
Exactly.
you make money on the retention, right? And but we've got that mixed up in that we spend way more money and time on the acquisition side,
Right.
and you know, and tend to drop the ball on the retention side.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, I've heard numbers anywhere it costs up to, $18 or more for an online company to, get a print customer, right? That's what it costs them to acquire. So which is why they do like, a big giveaway to at least get one thing from them and get them into the system so at least they can sell them something later.
Yeah, it really is, you know, I think this holistic view is, well, the main thing I focus on is trying to get people to see marketing as more than just advertising.
Right.
Right. That I have a 20-step framework that I get them to back up and say, let's just look at this from a beginning to end perspective, right? If you look at the customer's journey through your business over time, not just the single transaction,
Right.
but over, say, 10 years.
Right.
What experience am I creating? How do I facilitate their experience
Right.
so that I can maximize my earnings from those relationships?
Right.
So you're cultivating relationships, maximizing lifetime value, and generating all kinds of secondary sales as well as referrals and et cetera, right? And because you need that to offset the high cost of acquisition.
Right. Right.
But historically, I've seen people put way too much emphasis on the acquisition side and largely ignore the retention side. And the math, if you really understand the math, you'd flip it around.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's funny is I think a lot of very wildly successful companies are the ones you don't hear much about, right? Because they're just working on their existing customer base and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, in terms of the way our media works and how the business press works, right? The big and flashy get all the attention, but there's literally, thousands of companies that are kind of doing what you're doing. Hey, I'm just going to focus on my current customers and go where my bang for the buck is, and I'm not going to take out the splashy ads or have the TikTok influencer.
Well, it's a balancing thing, right? I'm not saying don't do it. What I'm saying is balance it, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying it's a matter of sort of as as we become a sort of media obsessed culture, right? We look for those kind of things when actually the hero companies are the ones that are not probably blasting things out.
The challenge really, I think, is getting people to realize that attention does not translate to sales.
Right. Not always.
It can translate to sales if you put the system in place to make sure it does,
right,
in a high probability.
Right.
But just by itself, without the system behind it, is very unlikely to.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Right. I mean, how many hot fad products have there been, right? Just in the last, forever, but in the last few years that got a lot of attention, but then just flopped in the marketplace.
Yeah, like anything, and this is why I try to get people to think about it more from a systems point of view, right? Not just do the single tactic and hope for the best. It's like chain them together as an actual system, right? We're going to do this lead offer, and we're going to do, when they get in the store, we're going to do this kind of promotions and this type of engagement and this kind of, how we're going to enroll them in our, sign up program, and this is how we're going to follow up with them. And it's like, if you think about it as this lifetime, this integrated approach,
right?
It really doesn't take a heck of a lot of extra. I mean, it's certainly not any more costly than advertising, right? It really just is a shift it's a different way of approaching it, right? It's less sort of hopeful and more engineered.
Right. I love that. That's a great slogan. I love that. Less hopeful, more engineered, right? I love that. That's awesome. So where can people go to learn about your 20 ways to fix your marketing? Where can people go for more information?
Well, the two places. One is my website, which is accruemarketing.com, and then Amazon. I have my books up on Amazon. It's probably the easiest place to buy it. It's called Being Profitable, a business development roadmap. But my website is full of, I've got 20 free downloads, ebooks for download. I've got a ton of resources. So I think the thing, if people want to understand more of this, I would invite them to take advantage of all the free resources at accruemarketing.com.
Awesome. Well, listen, John, it's been great talking to you, and I've learned a lot, and I appreciate your time, and best wishes, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciated the invitation to be on your show.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.